The barn doors slammed shut. She stood in silence, boots soaked with manure, her blouse damp with sweat and shame. One cowboy spat at her feet. Another laughed, tipping his hat with mockery. "They should have left you on that island," he muttered. "Worthless." What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet see, was that the woman standing before them had already survived jungle warfare, starvation, and surrender that nearly killed her. They saw a foreign face, a girl with calloused hands and haunted eyes, but she was a ghost with fire in her lungs, and by the time the frost came, she'd build something that would not only feed those very men, but would break them into silence. This is the story of a young Japanese POW sent not to a prison camp, but to the unlikeliest of places, a Texas cattle ranch, where humiliation became fuel, and what she built in the shadow of cruelty became something no one could ignore. The train hissed and lurched to a stop beneath the burning Texas sky, and the women inside braced themselves. Dust swirled like smoke across the tracks, curling around boots, fences, and low tin roofs. It was hot in a way they'd never known, thick, dry, unapologetic. The cattle ranch loomed ahead like something out of a postcard warped by heat and hate, wide fields, sagging barns, and a main house that stood like it was watching. The wooden sign out front read Gibson Farm, but that wasn't what the locals called it anymore. They called it Jap Camp. The name stuck, carried on wind and spit alike. As the women stepped down from the train, some clutching duffel sacks, others just holding their own trembling hands, the first thing they saw was the cowboy hats and the smirks underneath them. The ranch had been converted hastily, an experimental labor facility under U.S. military control, staffed in part by local ranchers and guards who had volunteered, or been told, to keep order. None had been trained in how to manage Japanese women prisoners, but they didn't need training. They had contempt. "Damn shame they didn't drown 'em all in the Pacific," one cowboy muttered as the women were lined up in the yard. He spat in the dirt and stared until one woman looked away. Another laughed, loud enough for the prisoners to hear. They were young men, mostly, in dusty denim and leather gloves. Some leaned against fence posts like the war had never touched them. Others stood with rifles slung loose, more for theater than threat. The war had ended, but the hatred hadn't. The women, about 24 in total, wore mismatched uniforms, some torn at the sleeves, others stained by weeks of transport. Their faces were drawn, pale beneath the sun. Not one of them spoke, not in Japanese, not in English. The silence wasn't submission. It was survival. It was the only control they had left. Akiko stepped off the train near the back of the line. She was 22, but looked older. War had carved hollows into her cheeks, and grief had taken the softness from her voice long before she lost the will to use it. Her uniform still bore the faded insignia of a military clerk, though no one here would care. She kept her hands folded neatly in front of her gaze low, and she moved with a precision that came from habit, not hope. She had no illusions about this place. The jungle had nearly killed her. The surrender had almost finished the job. This was just another kind of death. A guard barked orders. They were assigned to separate cabins, drafty, wooden bunkhouses once used for ranch hands. Akiko's smelled of mold and tobacco. Her mattress was straw. Her pillow was a folded tarp. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, and waited. It didn't take long. She was assigned the worst job on the first day, shoveling out the pig pens, her boots sinking into muck while the sun tore at her skin. By noon, the name-calling had begun. "Hey, Nip Girl, missed a spot. Tell her that's for pigs, not rice," one cowboy shouted. She even understand English? Or she just dumb and dirty?" They laughed at their own jokes. It was never clever. It didn't have to be. The goal wasn't humor. It was erasure. She didn't respond, not when they jeered, not when they flicked mud at her, not even when one of them poured the dregs of his coffee can over her bucket of clean water. She just kept working, quietly, methodically, as if each scoop of filth was something being pulled from inside her. That night, in the bunkhouse, she stared at the ceiling while the others whispered. One woman wept into her blanket. Another scratched mosquito bites until they bled. Akiko said nothing. She had spoken once, on the boat over. A single sentence to the Red Cross nurse who asked her name. Since then, silence had served her better. Outside, the cicadas screamed. The guards drank and laughed by a fire pit near the barn. Somewhere out in the dark, cattle moved, slow and unaware. It was a strange place, this place of dust and sun and cruelty hidden beneath protocol. The cowboys called it work. The officials called it regulation. Akiko knew better. This was not a camp. It was a test, and she would not break. Not yet. The word came 2 mornings later, tossed like trash behind her back. She was kneeling by the feed trough, scrubbing caked blood and slime from the wood while the sun climbed over the barn, turning every breath into a gasp of heat. One of the younger cowboys was watching her work. His boots were clean, his hat tilted low, and he chewed a sliver of straw like he was born to sneer. She had spilled a small bucket of feed the day before, tripped in the mud, her ankle twisting under her, the slop fanning out across the dirt. No one helped her. No one said a word, until now. "Don't know why we feed her at all," he muttered to the man beside him. "She's worthless." The other man grunted, but didn't disagree. Neither of them thought she heard. Neither of them cared if she did. Akiko didn't flinch. She kept scrubbing. Her hands moved slower, just slightly, but she did not turn. The water in the trough rippled. She could still hear the word days later, echoing through her like gunfire underwater. Not because it was new, but because it wasn't. She had heard worse. In the jungle, when her unit was overrun, she'd listened to the screams of men dying with no honor, begging for morphine. She was a clerk, not a soldier, but the American assault made no distinction. The last order she received came through static. Burn the files, destroy everything. She obeyed, hands shaking, while her younger brother, Hideo, barely 17, was outside with the infantry, shouting for her to hide in the trench. When the mortar hit, it was the wrong trench. She found his body 2 hours later, twisted beneath bamboo, half his face gone. She didn't cry then, either. They had told her capture was shame. That surrender made her less than a woman, less than human. She had whispered the code of Bushido in training until her lips bled from dryness. Better to die than be taken. But death never came. Only the Americans, with their commands and handcuffs and cold water. The boat that carried her to the mainland smelled of salt and vomit. The officer who guarded them wouldn't meet her eyes. By the time she reached Texas, the shame had calcified, solid and sharp, like something she could swallow when the sun went down. Now, here, the word worthless sat on her like dust, invisible, inescapable. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't spat. That would have been easier. It was worse than hate, it was dismissal. As if she were a weed, something bothersome and irrelevant, something less than alive. That evening she ate in silence, her food barely chewed. The other women around her talked in hushed tones. Some prayed. One carved a tally into the wooden wall above her cot, marking the days like a prisoner in a storybook. Akiko made no marks. She didn't count days, she didn't speak, and she didn't cry. Not when the pigs kicked slop into her face, not when the cowboy slapped the ladle out of her hand for moving too slowly in the mess hall, not when her hands bled from the work and no one noticed. Silence was her protest, her armor, her refusal to give them anything they could twist. But silence was also a cage. When the other prisoners huddled together for comfort, she sat alone. When they traded pieces of chocolate or whispered dreams of going home, she stared out the window. At night she lay rigid, eyes open, tracing the rafters with her thoughts. Sometimes, in the dark, she mouthed her brother's name, not loud enough to be heard, just enough to remember. She did not pray. Not any more. Not since the night she saw a chapel burned with civilians still inside, and an officer called it divine punishment. She didn't believe in divinity now, only in dirt, in sweat, in things that could be touched and scrubbed. But worthless was not one of those things. It could not be cleaned away. It was a shadow in the water, a stain beneath the skin. The next day she returned to the trough. The same cowboy passed her again, muttering to his boots. She didn't hear his words this time. Didn't need to. She knew their shape. Instead, she dipped her rag back into the bucket, watching the water darken. She scrubbed, not because she was broken, not because she agreed, but because the trough was not for him. It was hers now, and she would make it clean. The next day, as she carried a bucket of blood-stained rags behind the slaughterhouse, Akiko smelled something that didn't belong. Earth. Not the sour mix of manure and rot that hung around the pens, but something faint and sweet, like wet soil after a storm. She paused by the rusted fence where the waste was dumped, the sun low and blinding, and there it was, a sprout. No more than a finger high, clinging to a crack of dry land near the corner post. Its leaves were trembling, impossibly green. She stared at it, not because it was beautiful, but because it was alive. In a place meant for death, something had the audacity to grow. It reminded her of home. Not the bombed-out streets of Hiroshima she imagined now, but the before. The quiet mornings when her mother knelt in the dirt behind their house, sleeves rolled to her elbows, coaxing daikon shoots up from black soil with a tenderness that made no sound. Her mother never said much while gardening. She didn't need to. Her hands spoke everything. Akiko bent to touch the sprout, just for a moment. The soil crumbled beneath her fingertips, dry but not dead. She looked around. No one watched. The guards were smoking near the truck. The others were in the mess. She stood, heart thudding. That night, she could not sleep. In the storeroom behind the kitchen, a sack of cattle feed sat open. Dried kernels, rough and yellow, meant for pigs and troughs. She stole a handful, maybe 20, maybe 30 seeds, just enough to hide inside her blouse. Her fingers trembled as she tucked them into a corner of her cot. She felt like a child again, hoarding something secret and sacred. The next morning, before her shift began, she returned to the sprout. The ground was hard. She knelt and scratched with her nails, tearing the topsoil away in clumps. She dug 3 rows, shallow and crooked, her breath fast, her eyes darting to the fence. Then she planted the seeds. One by one, as if each were a prayer she no longer believed in, but still needed to say. There were no tools, no water but what she could steal from the wash bucket. Still, she returned every day, after meals, before work, in the soft pocket of twilight when the air smelled like fire and cattle. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. She wore her silence like a uniform, and it shielded her better than any guard could. Within a week, the first shoot appeared, then another, thin stalks, quivering under the weight of sun and wind. She had no idea what she was growing. Corn, maybe. Squash, maybe. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that something obeyed her hands again, that something rose when she told it to. The soil listened in a way no man here ever had. The garden was no bigger than a blanket, but to her it was the only real place in the camp. When they called her worthless, she thought of her rows. When they handed her a mop and pointed to a mess some man had made on purpose, she imagined roots curling in the dirt, drinking stolen water. She began saving scraps, eggshells, vegetable peels, bits of bread. She buried them in the garden like offerings, a quiet rebellion in compost. The pig pens still stank. The cowboys still laughed. But beneath their boots, beneath their insults, something was blooming. She didn't smile. Not yet. But her eyes changed. She watched the weather. She studied the ants. Her hands, once cracked from scrubbing, now carried the scent of soil. Life became her answer, and it did not need translation. By the third week, the garden was no longer a secret, but it remained unseen. The guards passed by it daily, boots crunching gravel, eyes scanning elsewhere, but they didn't look closely. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe a green patch behind a blood-soaked slaughterhouse didn't make sense in their world. That was fine. Akiko didn't need them to see it, but someone else did. Tomas. He was older than the rest, a ranch hand with skin like cracked leather and eyes always half-lidded, as if he'd seen too much and decided long ago to speak less. He was not military, not a cowboy. He moved slowly, with the rhythm of someone who had tilled the same earth for decades. He smelled of tobacco and sun. And he noticed things. One morning, as Akiko carried a dented bucket of gray dishwater across the lot, Tomas was sweeping the walk near the mess. Their eyes met briefly. He didn't smile, but he nodded. Not in greeting, in understanding. She kept walking. But something shifted. The next day there was a small tin can placed near the fence. Inside it, ashes, crushed eggshells, and coffee grounds. Fertilizer. She recognized it immediately. Thomas didn't say a word. He never did. But that afternoon, as she knelt in the dirt and spread the mixture beneath her rose, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Acknowledgement. Not charity, not pity, just respect. They began to exchange small offerings. He would leave an old glove and she would mend it with twine. She left a sprouting onion beside his broom. He dropped off an empty milk jug that she filled from the spigot to save her trips. They never spoke. They didn't need to. The garden was their language. Each morning, before the sun had burned the dew from the weeds, she checked the rows. Shoots became stalks. Leaves widened. A squash flower opened like a whisper. The plants had no map, no guide, but they reached upward anyway. That became her mantra. Reach anyway, grow anyway. In a place designed to erase her, she was building something that could not be unseen for long. Her body began to change. Her arms grew stronger. Her back hurt less. The deep hollows beneath her eyes softened. She was still mocked, still overworked. But now she had something to protect, something that answered back. Thomas sometimes stood nearby. His broom paused in mid-sweep, watching the leaves tremble in the wind. Once, he knelt beside her and pointed to a cluster of weeds creeping too close. She understood, pulled them, and they shared the smallest glance. Not triumph, just agreement. She started saving more kitchen scraps, hiding them in her sleeves, in the folds of her apron. The guards didn't question it. They barely looked at her anymore. That invisibility, once so cruel, now became armor. Behind the slaughterhouse, she fed her army of roots and stems with leftovers that had once been destined for pigs. The irony nourished her. One afternoon, she peeled back a leaf and found a fat cucumber resting beneath it. She cradled it in both hands, stunned. It was the first full thing she'd grown with her own hands since before the war. She didn't eat it. She didn't even keep it. She placed it in the kitchen crate with the others, quietly, without a name. The next day, it was sliced into the stew. No one knew where it came from. No one asked. But Tomas met her eyes over the pot and tipped his hat. Just once. And that was enough. Her garden was no longer hidden. It was part of the system now, feeding the same mouths that called her worthless. But she didn't feel like a prisoner when her hands were in the soil. She felt like a keeper of something sacred, something that couldn't be taken. She spoke no words, but the roots were fluent. The frost came early, sharp and cruel, like winter had taken a wrong turn and landed hard on Texas soil. The air bit through sleeves and stung lungs with every breath. That evening, a red sun dropped fast behind the trees, and the sky turned silver. The warning came from Thomas, one word whispered as he passed her in the yard: "Frio," cold. Then he pointed to the horizon and mimed rapping something. She understood. That night, when the others slept, Akiko crept out of the bunkhouse with arms full of burlap sacks and shredded rags she had scavenged from the laundry pile. The moon lit the field in pale gray, and her breath came in clouds. She knelt in the frozen dirt, fingers numb, and covered each row like a mother tucking in her children. Her nails split, her knees ached, but she moved with urgency, shielding the leaves from what was coming. The frost did not care who had suffered or who had prayed. It touched everything. By dawn, the garden was still. Ice clung to the edges of the tarp, glinting like glass. She peeled back the covers one by one. Some plants had burned black. The leaves curled in on themselves, but not all. The heart of the garden, her cucumbers, her squash, the fragile herbs, had survived. She let herself sit for a moment on the edge of the fence. Thomas passed by and paused. He looked at the rose, then at her blistered hands. He said nothing, but removed his cap. It was the closest thing to reverence she'd seen since arriving. 2 weeks later, stew was served again, thicker this time, warmer. It smelled of basil and green onion. The same cowboy who once called her worthless scraped his bowl clean and went back for more. As he dipped his spoon, he muttered, "Finally feeding us real food." He didn't know, or didn't care to ask. Akiko didn't look up from her spot at the end of the table. She had finished her bowl in silence. She had cooked none of it, but she had grown nearly all of it. She said nothing. She never did. But Thomas stood behind the pot, ladle in hand. He looked directly at the cowboy, and for the first time he spoke not to Akiko, but for her. "She grew it," he said, tapping the rim of the bowl. "The Japanese girl. This." He lifted the ladle and let it fall. "All her." Silence swept the mess hall like wind through dry leaves. A few men shifted. One coughed. The cowboy looked at Thomas, then at Akiko. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The only sound was chewing. No apology came, no thank you. But they didn't mock her that day, not once. In the days that followed, no one touched her garden. The guards still passed by. The cowboys still joked, but when her hands were deep in the soil, they no longer shouted over her. They left her space. Thomas walked slower when he passed, sometimes whistling soft tunes that reminded her of water and wood. She never asked for their approval, never expected it. The frost had taught her that survival was not about fairness. It was about persistence, the kind that worked through the night with shaking hands simply because something was worth saving. She had not spoken, but her silence now grew roots not just in the ground, but in the eyes of those who once looked through her. They still didn't see her fully, but they saw what she made, and that was the beginning. A week later, the announcement came during breakfast. The Red Cross had delivered new paper and stamps, and every prisoner would be given one opportunity to write home. One page, one envelope, no promises, no return address. Just a chance to send something out into a world they no longer recognized. Most women stared down at their trays, unsure what to say, unsure who might still be alive to receive it. Akiko froze, spoon in hand, the steam from her porridge curling like ghost smoke toward the ceiling. She hadn't seen her mother's face in 2 years. Hiroshima was a name she didn't let herself whisper. The blast had erased more than buildings. It had torn holes in memory. What was left of that house, of that garden, of the porch, where her brother once sharpened knives and hummed without rhythm? Still, she accepted the page. She took it like a relic, folded and creased by other hands. That night, beneath the dim bulb over the bunkhouse table, she stared at the blankness for hours before setting her pencil down. At first, the words came haltingly. "I am alive." Then nothing. Her fingers hovered. What else could she say that wasn't a lie? But the pencil didn't wait for answers. It moved, slowly, uncertainly, then faster. She wrote of the dirt beneath her nails, the shape of the leaves on her squash plants, the feel of frost on canvas at dawn. She told of Thomas and his hat, of stew warmed by stolen vegetables, of the silence, and how sometimes it rang louder than gunfire. Her grammar was fractured, her sentences lopsided, but her voice was clear. Not because of the words she used, but because of the ones she chose not to. She didn't write of cruelty, or humiliation, or of the word worthless. She didn't need to. The earth she described made the rest plain. By the time she stopped, the letter was 2/3 full. The pencil had left calluses on her fingers. She read it back only once, lips barely moving. Then she folded the page, slipped it into the envelope, and sealed it shut. No address, no return. Just her name printed neatly at the top corner. She handed it in the next morning. The guard didn't look at it, just added it to a pile and walked away. Akiko didn't expect it to reach anyone. Perhaps it would rot in a mailroom, or be opened and discarded by a man who didn't speak her language. But none of that mattered. The letter wasn't a message, it was a ritual. She began writing more after that. Not letters to send, but notes to bury. She tore scraps from the edges of old sacks and penciled small observations. Clouds shaped like home. Squash flower opened early. Tomas whistled again. She folded them into tiny squares and pressed them into the soil beneath her plants, like offerings to gods she no longer believed in. Her voice, long hidden in silence, had found new form. It wasn't loud, it didn't echo, but it persisted, like roots. The words weren't meant to be heard, they were meant to exist. Each scrap in the earth became a tether between what she had lost and what she was growing. The plants, fed by sun and scrap and secret, seemed to understand. They stood taller, blossomed brighter, and Akiko stood straighter, too. Not because the war was over, not because her name was remembered, but because, for the first time in years, she had written herself into the world again, not as a prisoner, not as a ghost, but as someone becoming. The shouting began just after midday. A crate of potatoes had gone missing from the mess, and the air snapped with tension before the accusation even left the cowboy's mouth. The guard stormed into the bunkhouse, red-faced and loud, dragging behind him one of the younger women, a girl named Natsuko, barely old enough to be here. Her pockets were still dusty from the root cellar. She cried as they yanked her forward. "She didn't act alone," the cowboy barked, eyes scanning the room. "They always move in pairs." Akiko stood at her cot, silent as stone. She hadn't spoken a word in weeks. That made her an easy target. When eyes landed on her, she didn't blink. "This one," the cowboy growled, pointing. "She's always sneaking off. Probably helped her." Akiko said nothing. The overseer stepped in, tall, pale, and sweat-stained, with a face that always looked like he'd just woken from a nightmare he blamed on others. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He looked once at the two women, then at Thomas, who had followed the noise in from the yard. "She do it?" he asked flatly. Thomas shook his head. "No, sir," he said. "She didn't touch a thing." The overseer raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "I seen her," Thomas said. "She was in the back, near the garden, working." The cowboy stepped forward, scoffing. "You gonna take her side over one of ours?" Thomas didn't answer, but the silence was loud enough. The overseer's eyes narrowed. He walked past Akiko without looking at her and stopped at the door. "If I find one more thing missing," he said, voice low and steady, "I burn that patch of dirt to the ground. You hear me?" Akiko heard. So did everyone else. The next morning the frost had melted, but the cold remained. Akiko rose early. Her plants, still damp with dew, quivered in the breeze. The garden had survived so much. The soil still held her scraps, her prayers, her pages, but none of that would matter to men who saw it only as property. Or punishment. She entered the mess hall before breakfast. No one saw her. The overseer's office door was cracked open, a fan humming faintly inside. His desk was cluttered, papers, ration logs, a rusted pen. Akiko stepped in without sound. In her hand, wrapped in a napkin, was a single seed. She placed it gently on the center of the desk. Nothing else. No note, no accusation. Just the seed. She stood still for a moment, then whispered one word. "Grow." Then she left. No one mentioned the missing potatoes again. Natsuko was reassigned to the laundry. The overseer said nothing, but he didn't return to the garden. Tomas didn't either. Not for 3 days. When he finally did, he brought with him a rusted trowel and a half-empty tin of beans. "You keep planting," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." Akiko nodded. She didn't smile, but her hands moved faster that day, her rows straighter, her roots deeper. The power had not shifted. Not truly. The guards still barked, the rules still bound, but something had been offered. A single word, placed like a seed and left to take root. It would not feed them yet, but it would grow. By April, the earth had softened. Winter retreated like a bitter memory, and the garden, once no more than bruised soil and stolen scraps, exploded in quiet color. Squash vines twisted over fence posts. Beans clung to their twine like fingers to hope. Even the rosemary, clipped back too many times, had pushed through with new green tips. The smell of onions and herbs drifted across the yard, bleeding into the kitchens, into the mess hall, into the mouths of the same men who once called her nothing. Akiko no longer had to hide her buckets of peelings or save rainwater in secret. She walked with them in full view now. And though no one said it, they all knew. The kitchen was feeding better because of her. The food no longer tasted like rations. It tasted like something someone cared for, something planted, not processed. The guards didn't clap. The cowboys didn't thank her. But one morning, by the spigot, someone left a packet of marigold seeds beside her water can. No note, just the seeds. She found them just before dawn. She stared at the bright orange label for a long time. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was a gesture, a quiet one, A seed for a woman who had given them food and never asked for anything in return. A week later, a different cowboy passed her by the main gate. She recognized him, the one who used to spit when she walked near. He didn't speak, but this time he nodded, just once. She didn't return it. But she didn't look away. None of this changed her past. It didn't rewrite the word that had followed her through the dirt. Worthless. But she hadn't heard that word in months. Now, when people said her name, it hung in the air alone. Unattached. Enough. Akiko had changed too. She still walked softly, but her shoulders no longer curled inward. She no longer flinched when men raised their voices. When a tray was dropped, she didn't brace for blame. Something had shifted inside her, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, like the turn of soil after rain. The garden had taught her that you don't always get to choose the ground you're planted in, but you still grow. You grow in silence, in filth, under frost. You grow anyway. Tomas still worked the yard, his broom slower now. He didn't speak of the incident with the potatoes or the seed on the overseer's desk, but he kept leaving things, an old pail, rusted scissors, a tin of salt. Their rhythm remained. No talk, no questions, just shared space and sweat. Even the other POWs had changed. They began to help her without being asked, loosening soil, tying stalks, carrying water. One girl braided twine for the cucumber poles, another fashioned scarecrows from scraps. It was no longer her garden, it was theirs, but they all knew who had started it. The marigolds bloomed by the end of spring, bursting through the back fence with wild orange fire. No one ate them. That wasn't their purpose. They were there to say, "We are still here, and we can be beautiful too." Akiko never asked for an apology. She knew better. But in every gesture, every unspoken nod, every planted seed, every untouched marigold, there was something close. Not forgiveness, but recognition. And sometimes that was enough. If you're still watching and moved by Akiko's story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to like the video so we can keep sharing more stories like this. The notice came in the form of a name called it roll call. No ceremony, no warning, just a slip of paper handed off by a guard with sunburned knuckles and a voice too tired to gloat. The war was over. The camps were closing. Akiko would be repatriated within the week. She said nothing, just nodded once, folded the paper, and walked back to the bunkhouse with a silence that no longer felt heavy. In the days that followed, she moved slowly through her routines, but now every step carried a whisper of goodbye. She trimmed the garden one last time, careful not to break the stems. She packed no souvenirs, no photos. There were none to take. Just two things, a napkin, folded in quarters, the word "grow" written in pencil across its center, and a packet of dried seeds, their corners soft from time. When she left the bunkhouse for the last time, Thomas stood by the gate. He said nothing, but offered her an apple wrapped in a cloth. She accepted it with both hands and bowed, low and deep. It was the first time she had bowed since her capture. It wasn't submission. It was gratitude. The train came at dawn, screeching into the station like an iron beast, pulling the future behind it. She boarded with a group of other women, all silent, all waiting. None knew what they were returning to. Some would go back to cities flattened by bombs, others to villages that no longer existed. Akiko didn't know what stood where her house had once been, but she knew what she carried. As the train pulled away, the countryside blurred past the window. Texas rolled out before her, endless, open, stubborn land. She watched mesquite trees pass like sentinels, watched the sun rise slow and gold across the flatness. She used to hate this place, hate the dry wind, the dust in her teeth, the sound of boots behind her. But now, as fields whipped by in waves, something had shifted. It wasn't love, that would be too simple. But it wasn't hate, either. This land had starved her, hurt her, called her names that echoed in the dark, and yet this same land had fed her, grown roots under her fingers, given her the silence to find her voice again. Memory is never clean. It's layered, mud and rain, wound and bloom. Akiko knew that now. As the train clattered north, she looked at the packet of seeds in her lap. They were just kitchen scraps once, saved from animal feed, planted in stolen soil, raised under frost and fear. Now they were dry, brittle, waiting, but not dead. She imagined pressing them into new earth, somewhere quieter, maybe near the sea, maybe under trees. She would not have the same garden again, but maybe she didn't need to. Maybe it wasn't the garden that mattered. Maybe it was what it had taught her. The train rocked gently, a lullaby of metal and motion. Around her, the other women had begun to speak, soft, stilted words about home, about what they'd return to. Akiko listened, but didn't join. Not yet. She opened the napkin once more, smoothing it on. Her knee! The pencil had faded slightly, but the word was still there. Grow. She traced the letters with one fingertip, then folded it again, slowly, like a prayer. Outside, the land rolled on, foreign and familiar all at once. She didn't know what waited at the end of the tracks, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was going home, or somewhere that could be home, and she was ready to plant again. The years that followed did not unfold in grand gestures or sweeping recoveries, but in small, deliberate acts. One seed pressed into waiting earth, one breath taken at sunrise, one quiet choice to continue living in a world that had once felt too heavy to hold. Hiroshima was changed when Akiko returned, but it was not the wasteland she had feared. There were scars, burned timbers, twisted metal, empty lots where houses used to stand. But there was also rebuilding. Smoke had faded. Children played again in narrow streets. Women knelt in gardens, coaxing life out of wounded soil. Life, as it always had, insisted on returning. Akiko settled in a small town just outside the city, in a house with a slanted roof and a patch of land behind it no larger than a sleeping mat. She married a carpenter who had survived the blast by chance, saved only because he had been working miles away. He was gentle, patient, and quiet, like someone who understood what it meant to lose a world and build another one carefully, piece by piece. They had one daughter, Hana, a serious-eyed child who often watched her mother with thoughtful curiosity. The garden behind their home began small, as all things worth growing do. At first, Akiko planted the familiar: daikon, green onions, shiso. She tended them every morning before the house stirred awake, her knees pressing into cool soil, her fingers working with a tenderness learned long ago in a faraway land she spoke of only in pieces. But as years passed, unfamiliar shapes appeared among the rows. Cornstalks rose, tall and proud against the sky. Okra pods dangled like green lanterns. A stubborn line of marigolds burned orange along the fence. Neighbors whispered about the foreign plants. Some asked where she had learned to grow such odd vegetables. Akiko only smiled, the kind of smile that held an entire story behind it, one she rarely told. One afternoon, as wind rustled the leaves and sunlight pooled across the garden, little Hana tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she asked, tilting her head, "why do we grow things no one else grows?" Akiko paused, her hands still buried in the soil. She had expected the question eventually. Hana was observant, more than most children her age. Akiko looked at the okra pods glistening with dew, the corn tassels brushing the sky, the marigolds nodding in the soft breeze. For a moment, she was back in Texas, dust in her teeth, frost burning her knuckles, a trowel in her hand, and fear in her chest. She heard Thomas humming behind her. She saw the overseer's desk, the napkin, the seed, the single word, grow. She did not answer immediately. Some truths required silence before they could be spoken. Finally, she brushed a strand of hair from Hana's forehead and said softly, "I learned in a place very far from here." Hana blinked. "Was it a school?" Akiko shook her head. "Then where?" She rested her hand on the stem of a corn plant, feeling its strength. "In a place," she murmured, "where they called me worthless." Hana frowned, confused, but before she could speak, Akiko squeezed her hand gently, offering reassurance in touch rather than explanation. Some things were too large for a child to hold. The garden swayed in the wind, leaves whispering like old friends sharing secrets. Akiko stood among them, older now, but unbroken, rooted in the life she had built. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something she carried home, something she planted, something that grew. Not rage, not revenge, seeds. And because of that, her daughter would grow up in a world touched not by the cruelty she endured, but by the quiet defiance she cultivated, one root, one leaf, one season at a time. If this story touched you, like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like this deserve to live beyond the barbed wire of history.